Shabbat Shalom. I want to talk this week about animal sacrifices, korbanot. We begin this Shabbos to read from Sefer Vayikra, Torah Kohanim, which deals, for the most part, certainly in the first part of Sefer Vayikra, with animal sacrifices. And I think we may be ready now to appreciate and consider the Rambam's very unusual and controversial Tam Mitzvah explanation why we have animal sacrifices, an explanation which is so against the grain of standard Jewish thinking that a lot of people prefer to make believe we didn't say it or not pay attention to it. So that's what we're going to look at this week. So the Rambam says that sacrifices are what we would call a secondary intention. In other words, the main purpose of the Torah is to, first of all, get rid of false beliefs, to wean the Jews away from avodah zarah, and to install moral behavior, instill moral behavior. And it has to be done in a certain way for the very reason that we are humans. Kadosh Baruch Hu, God, can do anything, but the Torah is designed for humans, and it has to direct people, guide people, educate people in a manner that's conducive to human nature, how humans can change from one set of beliefs to another, or improve their moral character. And these have a lot to do also with the social mores, because, like it or not, we are like the rest of the world, and basically share many conventions with them. And so, at the time of Matan Torah, we have to take into consideration the historical circumstances. The Torah is eternal, but it was given at one particular time to a people living in a certain historical circumstances. The Jews had come out of Egypt, where they had sunk into idolatry. They had, in the course of centuries of living in Egypt and being enslaved in Egypt, had been assimilated in many ways, had nearly lost, as the Rambam tells us in Hilchot Avodah Zarah, nearly lost everything that Avraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov had achieved in terms of building a community, a monotheistic community based on moral principles. These were the people that basically HaKadosh Baruch Hu had to work with, that Moshe had to work with, as we can see parsha after parsha. And the laws of the Torah were designed with that in mind as well. Now, at that time, the notion of worshiping a god without building a temple and slaughtering animals and sacrificing them was absurd. It's like today, the Rambam says, it's like today telling people, you don't have to pray to worship God. People say, that's nonsense, that's ridiculous, how could that be? And don't forget that today, it's not just Jews that pray. Muslims build houses of worship and pray there. Christians build houses of worship and pray there. Buddhists, Hindus, they all do it. In those days, everyone was building, they were worshiping multiple gods, they were worshiping false gods, but they were building houses of worship where they sacrificed animals. So what the Torah did, and this is what the Rambam calls in Arabic guidance, not only by wisdom, hikmah, but what he calls in Arabic this nice word, talatuf, meaning a sort of kind, gentle way to ease you into the right behavior. Professor Pinas translates it gracious ruse. What he did was to appropriate the idea of temples and animal sacrifices. To appropriate means we take over this form of worship, which was already well established in the world and used by people in idol worship, but make certain fundamental changes there, which will, in the end, achieve the Torah's goal of getting us getting us away from false beliefs and recognizing the one true God and instilling moral and ethical behavior. So, just to give a couple of examples of how this works, for instance, the first thing that the Rambam notes when he goes through the details of korbanot are the animals that he chosen for sacrifice. Mina bakar, mina tzon, mina izim, cattle, sheep, and goats. Now he points out that each of these animals was actually an object of worship among the primitive peoples, or the peoples in the area at the time of Matan Torah. A lot of people felt that these demons resided in goats. People still think that there's something demonic sometimes about goats and goat's head soup and all that. The Egyptians, of course, according to Torah, were worshiping sheep, and that's what Moshe says. How can we possibly sacrifice sheep in Egypt? People will stone us because we're killing their gods. And as far as cattle, well, the Rambam actually mentions India, where cattle are still considered holy. So the Torah says, take these three animals specifically that are worshipped and considered divine and almost beyond, you can't be touched them in other cultures, and slaughter them in front of the one God. And this way, you'll sort of, in a way, slaughter the belief in this idolatry. And he goes on by detail by detail to show how this works. With regard to the moral aspect, well, the one thing the Rambam points out, it's very interesting. We have these laws in certain korbanot of notar. Korbanot, the dava, netted the dava, the people bring as a sort of voluntary offering, and other sacrifices as well have a time limit, a very short time limit, a day or 2 days at the most, I think, in which the meat can be consumed. Now, it's a lot for one person to eat even a side of meat, not to mention a whole animal within a day or 2 days. So instead of people will decide, instead of simply burning this meat and destroying it, well, I'll invite my friends and family and invite the poor. I've got to get rid of all this whole sheep within 2 days. So let all the poor in Yerushalayim come and help me finish it. And this brings about social bonding and as I said again, helping out the poor people. These are just two examples of how the details of the sacrifices, even though sacrifices in themselves are not an end needed. The true worship, the Rambam says, is intellectual worship, thinking about God, refining your conception of God, making sure that you're not, in whatever your mind conceives God to be, you're not attributing to Him any characteristics that can only belong to material objects. That's the highest form of worship. But this type of worship achieves, gets us well along the way in the manners that I have just specified. And the Rambam goes on to this at length in a couple of chapters in the third part of his Guide of the Perplexed. Now, I've already mentioned that according to Rambam, and it seems clearly to be the case, the sacrifices and the rules accompanying them were tailored to a certain situation, the situation of Bnei Israel at the time that they left Egypt and received the Torah. And this leads us to think that this is somehow bound to a certain historical situation, which is no longer present. And I think somehow this is one of the reasons why it's so controversial. But I somehow connect this with the fact that the Rambam, and only the Rambam, in his law code, the Mishnah Torah, includes all the details of the temple rituals and the sacrifices. The other Baalei Halacha would have probably not agree with the Rambam's locating the laws in this particular circumstances of Yetziat Mitzrayim, but since the temple had not been standing for 1,000 years or so, when before Jews began writing these law codes, they didn't bother to put all the rules down. There's no section, the Shulchan Aruch or the Torah, that deal with it. And the Rambam maybe is making a statement that these are eternal laws, and even if the Beit HaMikdash has not been standing for a long time, and even though his own Talmud Mitzvah makes the sacrifice as only a secondary intention, the laws are still binding. But we still have to face up to the Rambam, what the Rambam said, and I would just like to end with 2 points. First of all, I think the most important thing in dealing with the Rambam's analysis is to accept that that's what he says. Because, as I said, it's so against the grain of the type of the run-of-the-mill stuff you read in Torah sheets and Parsha videos that people just will ignore it or will not face up to. That's what he says, and in so many matters we have people who want to make the Rambam their hero, but can't handle what he really says, and so they put out all these lies, and it's no gentle way to put it than to say that they're lies, that the Rambam changed his mind late in life and ditched all this philosophy and bought into the Kabbalah. That's a lie, not a second version, not a hidden secret that people have, but it's simply a lie. And we should follow instead the model of the Ramban, a great Kabbalist, a great thinker, and above all, someone who was intellectually honest and knew that the Rambam meant what he said, and so he criticizes him very harshly. The second thing I want to say is, is in our own day. I think, that a lot of people here, there's a lot of talk now about, of the temple and studying the rituals and practicing the rituals and getting ready for rebuilding the temple. And all that is fine and well. But I think we also, in some way, this third Beit HaMikdash will come down from heaven, so we don't have to do really anything other than, make ourselves worthy by our proper beliefs and our proper behavior. But a lot of it also has to do with the fact that if we could be honest with ourselves, the idea of animal sacrifices does not appeal to us. And that it's hard to think of someone in our own day thinking that the best way to worship God is to drag a sheep to the temple and slit the sheep's throat and squirt sprinkle the sheep's blood onto the altar and burn the innards. That's not what we consider to be a true religious act, and we have to admit it. And I'm sure that it makes just many of us feel queasy to think about it. And I think that's part of the reason why, with the establishment of the State of Israel and the liberation of Jerusalem, there was really no move in that direction. Don't forget that the Rambam says that in his day, and it's true in our own day, to say we can do without sacrifices is to say we can do without prayer, and we can't do without prayer. And so when we liberated Jerusalem, immediately the kotel was cleared. The area in front of the kotel was cleared to make room for prayer, and ever since it's been mobbed with Jews, and even the most extremist of the so-called peace camp who think that somehow they're going to save the world by giving our land to our enemies, realize that this kotel, this place of prayer, has to stay as a place where Jews can gather to pray, and whereas the idea of aggressively trying to build a temple on the Temple Mount is something that only a very small handful of people think is a appropriate way to act. So I think these are just my thoughts, but I think the Rambam, there's no compulsion to believe or accept everything the Rambam says, but there is a moral imperative, an ethical imperative to admit to take what he says at face value and deal with it on his own terms. If you decide that you don't like his explanation, then the Ramban, a great thinker in his own right, is one of many who will give you an alternative. Thank you, and Shabbat Shalom.